Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very excited and pleased to have Nicholas Christakis back on the podcast. Nicholas was previously on the podcast a couple months ago, I guess over a year ago, actually. And this was right when Apollo's Arrow is a book that he wrote on COVID-19. He wrote it during kind of the height of the pandemic. It had come out. It's a fantastic book. And we had a great conversation all about COVID. And so Nicholas has written a few books. And one of the books that he's written is a book I really wanted to talk to him about. Of course, COVID was, kind of raging throughout the world. And so I wanted to just kind of get that timely. But I did tell him, I said, listen, come back on and let's talk about a book that he spent many years writing. That book is called Blueprint: The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society. And that's what we talk about in the conversation. Nick is a MD, he's a physician, he's a sociologist, he's a PhD in sociology. He also has a master's of public health. So he's wearing a lot of hats. He's a social scientist, he's a physician, he teaches at Yale, he directs the Human Nature Lab and is the co-director of the Yale Institute for Network Science. He's the Sterling Professor of Social and Natural Science at Yale University. And he's also been named in 2009, Time Magazine's annual list of 100 most influential people in the world. And in 2009 and in 2010, he was listed by Foreign Policy Magazine in their annual list of top 100 global thinkers. So his reputation precedes him. And I was super happy to talk to him. And in this conversation, we talk all about Blueprint. Or mostly, I should say, about Blueprint. We start the conversation by talking about kind of his major thesis of that book on how humans are very cooperative and they're good in one sense and more than we realize. And we talk about how we emphasize kind of the perversions of our humanity, all of the negative things about our humanity. But his emphasis is one of optimism, of one of, humans couldn't survive so long without some adaptive qualities, such as cooperation, altruism, interdependence. We talk about the social suite, these kind of 8 ideas within the social suite that he discusses in the book. We talk about unintentional, intentional, and artificial communities. We talk about the positive and negative aspects of cooperation and where punishment fits into the picture. We talk about his work on social networks and talk a little bit about friendships. We talk about aspects of in-group tribalism. We talk about social learning, teaching, and then culture. And then we end the conversation with some updates on COVID. It's been, a full 2.5 years, coming up on 3 years since the pandemic started. And, Nicholas has been kind of a beacon of light and a good source of good data and the quest for truth, for understanding the most current and up-to-date information. He has many wonderful threads on Twitter, and he's really just a powerful contributor to science communication on this topic. He's somebody that I trust. He's someone that I look to for accurate information on COVID and pandemics in general. And so if you're not following him, you definitely should. He's a great source of information. This conversation was such a wonderful conversation to have. Nicholas has so much energy. He has so much passion. He's obviously brilliant. And it's a real honor to always talk to him. And he was so gracious with his time. And so I'm very, very proud to bring this conversation I had with Nicholas Christakis. I'm here with Nicholas Christakis. Nick, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast. I'm super excited. I'm super thrilled to talk to you. We've talked before. For listeners, they can go back and listen to that episode. We talked about mostly the pandemic and all things COVID. Maybe we'll kind of do a brief 5-minute update or something towards the end of the conversation. And that was about Apollo's Arrow, which came out, I believe, last year, and so that was fantastic. I absolutely love that conversation, and I wanted to get you back on though to talk about the book that didn't take you 8 months to write during a pandemic.
4 months. I wrote Apollo's Arrow.
4 months. Jeez. Oh my goodness. Yeah. No, I want to talk to you about Blueprint: Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society, which is a absolutely marvelous book. So, anyways, just tell folks just the abbreviated version of who you are, what you're doing now, and we can get into Blueprint.
Well, I'm a physician. I was a hospice doctor. I took care of people who were dying for many, many years, but I stopped seeing patients, 10 years ago. And I'm also a research scientist. I'm trained in sociology, but I use quantitative methods to study human social interactions. So I study everything from social networks to social robotics to the microbiome and how it spreads from person to person, to epidemiology and how germs might spread, or sort of public health topics. So my lab is called the Human Nature Lab at Yale, and we investigate so many different aspects of human social interactions, how and why we have friends, for example, and what it means for our lives that we make these elaborate networks that we then live in, and that places at risk for learning new things or being infected with bad germs or being subjected to violence. All of that relates to where you are in a network, for example. So that's a little bit about me and what my lab has been doing.
Yeah, I think it's marvelous. I think it's one of those interesting things where people will say, when I talk to young people and they're trying to figure out where they want to go in life, what they want to do, and when people come on here and they introduce themselves, it's just really interesting how there's different ways you can work with people, right? I do clinical psych and working with people on a daily basis, in a clinical sense, therapy, whatnot. But you're working with people also, both, it sounds like you have worked with people kind of one-on-one, but then also now studying big groups of people, right? Yes. And how do people work together, and how do their networks coordinate or don't? And so that's really one of the things that drew me to Blueprint, which was, it's aside from it, the content was just how does all this stuff work together? And so I guess my first major introductory kind of question of sorts for the book is, there's humans are pretty terrible to each other, right? There's people will talk about human nature as being terrible and awful and all these things. And you highlight, yeah, that's true, but also there's a lot of cooperative aspects to who we are as humans and how we have evolved, both in our history past and how we currently are, still cooperative. So just kind of what was the kind of whole central thesis of the book of trying to explain that side of human nature?
Well, it's partly driven by a scientific interest and partly by my personality, I suppose. And my personal philosophy, which is that I'm an optimist characterologically, and I also think I'd rather see the world in a positive light if I can during my brief stint on this planet.
Sure.
And actually, I'll go on a digression and I'll come back to answer your question. Many years ago, when I was a medical student, so this was like 40 years ago or 35 years ago, I was in Boston, and there was some research that was being done at MIT, and it was being covered on NPR. And I was driving to medical school, Harvard Medical School, where I was a student on that particular day, and I was in Cambridge and driving across the river to Boston, and I was listening to this NPR story about this scientist at MIT that was studying the brains of Buddhist monks. And MRI technology was very new technology at the time, and you could use it to do volumetric analyses of different parts of people's brains and the size of those parts and how they might differ across different kinds of people and so on. And he was interviewing this Buddhist monk about his meditative practice and about his serenity and his optimism. And the monk described how he had this deliberate desire to see things in the most favorable light and to basically constantly re-narrate the world around him. And so I can't remember the specific circumstance of why the interviewer asked this question, but the gist of the question was to the monk was, what would you do if someone, just cut you off in traffic? Maybe they were in a car at the time doing the interview. I don't remember the details. And in a very aggressive way, and you might, lose your life or something. And the monk, without missing a beat, said, well, he goes, I would imagine that in that car, there was a woman in the back seat, and she was delivering a baby. And her husband was in the front, and he was desperate to get her to the hospital in time. And how wonderful it was that there was this new life that was coming into the world, and how concerned that man must be, and how necessary must be his actions, and so on. And I heard this. I was a young man. I was 25 or whatever I was. And I heard this monk talking this way, and it was like a revelation to me. It was like, I want to be like that. I want to be like that guy. And I pulled over to the side of the street and just listened to this man. And so I'd like to be that way if I can be. And I think, characterologically optimistic, but also I'm scientifically more interested in good than evil. And so on a scientific level, I think, as you mentioned, as you were introducing this question, I think for too long, both scientists and the person on the street have been overly obsessed with the dark side of human nature, with our capacity for evil, for our capacity for violence and mendacity and thievery and all kinds of awfulness. And I think the bright side has been denied the attention it deserves, because equally we are capable of love and friendship and cooperation and teaching and all these wonderful things. And in fact, my argument is that this good must necessarily have outweighed the bad, that the benefits of a connected life must have outweighed the costs. Because look, if every time I came near you, you were violent towards me, or you filled me with lies, or you took my stuff, I would be better off living apart from you. So it must be the case that I get more out of living socially than I lose. And it's that more part that I was interested in, and that Blueprint is basically about.
Yeah, it's so funny as you were telling the story about the monk. I think of this guy's doing the exact opposite of the fundamental attribution error, right? Which is, we're overestimating the dispositional qualities of people, right? Saying like, oh, this person cut me off because they're just an asshole, right? Instead of maybe the situational things, which is exactly right. Like maybe someone is, they have someone in the passenger seat about to give birth, or someone needs to get to a hospital, or whatever it may be.
More generally. I mean, this has been, this is a broader phenomenon right now, where I think we tell people, not just young people, but everyone, that they are victims, or that they are fragile, or that they are marked indelibly and permanently and incorrigibly by any bad thing that happens to them. And bad things will happen to every human being. Your parents will get divorced, or one of them will die. Your sibling will die. You'll get a serious illness. You'll lose your job. Your house will burn down. I've had 2 adult friends I'm 60, whose houses burned to the ground, whose your children will get sick. You'll have, some kind of, you'll be mugged, or you'll be a victim of crime or assault. So it's very difficult to live a life in which you are never exposed to anything bad. And I think, in an ideal, and this, I'm sure, of your clinical work, I mean, the ideal psychological approach to that is basically to compartmentalize it and to integrate it, and to not believe that it permanently affects you and everything that you do, that this means that for the rest of your life, you're, a victim of circumstance and have no agency. So I don't think that's very healthy psychologically. And I also don't think it's, as I said, given our one precious life, I don't think that's the best way to spend our time on the planet. So for a host of reasons, I'd like to see things, differently.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I mean, there's, bad stuff's going to happen in the world, and what, attribution or what value we place on it is kind of up to us. Although you could probably say some things are, I don't know, say universally bad, but most people would probably accept that it's pretty bad. But yeah, how are we handling sort of these things?
Even Viktor Frankl, right? In Man's Search for Meaning.
Yes.
The man is in a concentration camp.
Right.
They have killed his pregnant wife. His beloved wife has been put to death. Mm-hmm. Is almost dead from famine. Mm-hmm. And ultimately he survives, and he writes Man's Search for Meaning in like four days or like a week within his release, goes back to Vienna and mm-hmm. writes this book. And the basic insight of the book is actually very similar to Marcus Aurelius's insight from 2,000 years ago, which is ultimately the only thing you can control, and ultimately, in fact, your salvation is the recognition that they can take everything away from you except how you think of the situation you are in, mm-hmm. what's in your own mind. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that's easy.
Sure, of course.
But it's an important insight, right, mm-hmm. about our predicament.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's the book I probably recommend the most to people because it's so almost timeless in how it's trying to understand the human condition. Which is, look, if I can figure this out, that I still have agency, I still have freedom, I still have ability to be authentic with myself and others. Maybe others can. You don't have to go through a concentration camp to get that, right? But if he can do that. Maybe some people can glean some insights there. So I absolutely agree.
Well, the most amazing thing on that, again, we're meandering. I apologize for our conversation. Is the version of the book I have. I actually have two different copies of Man's Search for Meaning, but one particular one I have has as a supplement a correspondence that he wrote with some Viennese, I think, or primarily maybe some German, I don't remember, interlocutors afterwards. So he wrote Man's Search for Meaning, but he also had all these letters with people. Mm-hmm. And what's astonishing about those letters is many of the people, as he actually had the opportunity to escape Vienna, and he decided to stay behind because he had elderly parents and he didn't want to abandon them. He could have left with his pregnant wife. Right. And eventually those parents were also put to death. His wife, everyone dies except him. And nobody lifts a finger to help them. Mm. In fact, many others in the city denounced them and were Nazis. And he forgives them all. Yeah. I mean, it's
powerful.
Unbelievable. Yeah. Unbelievable, actually.
Yeah. I mean, he was a special person. And,
of course.
And it's an incredible thing, though, to know so many lessons that, if more people did, 10% of kind of some of the things he did, I think we'd be a little bit better.
Yes, that's 100% right.
You mentioned early in the book, which kind of sets the tone for much of the rest of the book, is something called the social suite. So there's 8 categories. You don't have to go through all 8, but just kind of, you mentioned this almost like etic notion of universality of sorts, right?
Yes.
And so what is it about, what is the social suite, and what are the kind of features of it that help us understand some of those components for, all of humanity and how we can understand all of humanity?
So I make an argument in the book that there are 8 core features of social order that are genetically encoded, evolutionarily shaped, universally manifested, and interpersonally expressed. Mm. So these include our capacity for cooperation, our capacity for friendship, our capacity for culture and learning, social learning and teaching, our propensity to have in-group bias, the fact that we prefer the company of people like us, our group, compared to others, and so on. There are 8 total ones, 8 of these traits. We can enumerate them if you want. But the important thing about it, to my eye, is they are qualities that we manifest between ourselves. In other words, evolution could shape a behavioral trait within me. For example, my religiosity, my propensity to believe in things unseen, like a higher power, or my bravery, right? Like some people could be brave and some people could not be brave. Mm-hmm. And it's not hard to imagine that has something to do with our genetics, and that evolution might shape that, or our risk aversion, our risk taking and risk aversion. These are all, but the thing about all of those traits, religiosity, bravery, risk aversion, and so on, they are things we can manifest as individuals in isolation. Because I don't need anyone else around me to pray, to fight a wild animal, to take a risk and explore a cave or something like that. But the things I'm interested in are things that require others. For example, love.
Yeah.
We're not interested in whether you love yourself. We're interested in whether you love others. Or kindness or cooperation. We're not interested in whether you're kind to yourself. We're interested in whether you're kind to others. Or justice. We're not interested in whether you're just to yourself, but whether you're just to others. So all of these are qualities, you see, which we manifest interpersonally and which have been shaped by natural selection to allow us to live together and form kind of convivial groups and societies wherein the benefits of a connected life outweigh the costs. So that's what the social suite is. It's a set of 8 genetically encoded, evolutionarily shaped, interpersonally manifested features required for social order. And I would say they are also good, good for us.
Mm-hmm. But I think it's important, right? Because it's obviously if we're social mammals, which we are, it's not almost that these things are that they exist, but I think it starts to begin, as you I think detail in the book, of how we do those things and then how different people through time do those. So love looks different in different types of relationships, or how cooperation can look different.
Relationships can be different. You can have heterosexual or homosexual relationships. You can have polygyny and polyandry and monogamy and all kinds of sexual patterns. But what's distinctive about our species compared to certain other species, or most other species, is that we form a sentimental attachment to the individuals with whom we are having sex with most of the time. Not always, of course. You don't need love for sex, but usually we fall in love. Okay.
Right.
And we are, and I talk about the evolution of monogamy in the book. It's actually a vast and difficult topic. And it's shaped both by our biology and by our culture. And it's gone back and forth in different sorts of ways. Roughly speaking, these time periods feather into each other. So it's not a straight line story, and it's not a clear story, but we are primarily monogamous. And more important than that, we form a sentimental attachment to our partners. We have this capacity to do that. And it's beautiful, actually, if you think about our capacity for love. It's not necessary for reproduction, and yet we do it.
Yeah, there's a depth and a richness, I think, to it that is, maybe there in other species or other animals, but there's certain particularities of how we do it, which I think is interesting. You talk about basically the 3 different types of communities, which is super interesting. I remember the first time I read the book, I was, wow, I've never seen anybody actually look at this kind of data or information. And so you talk about unintentional communities, right? So you have this really cool chapter on shipwrecks, right? Which not only, but mostly on shipwrecks, which is super fascinating. You talk about intentional communities and then artificial communities. So maybe just kind of, tell us, how did you kind of organize it that way, and what are kind of the unique features of all 3?
Well, if you were a mad scientist, and I am at times a mad scientist, what you would love to do to test some of these ideas would be to take a group of babies and abandon them on some isolated island and somehow miraculously contrive for them to be fed and raised, and then come back in 30 years and see what kind of social order did they make for themselves. In other words, when left to their druthers, how did they organize themselves? Did they have friendships? Did they love their partners? Did they have mild hierarchy? Did they prefer their own group to other groups? Or all of these kind of qualities, features of the social suite, were those manifested in this crazy thought experiment. Now, it turns out that variants of this experiment have actually been considered by monarchs for thousands of years, usually in the context of trying to answer the question, what kind of language comes naturally to us? So I think Psamtik I in Egypt, I forgot how long ago, I'm going to say 3,000 years, but I don't remember offhand, or a Scottish king about 500 years ago, these and many others wondered, well, if humans were raised without being spoken to, what language would they speak naturally? And so they contrived to do experiments where a couple of babies might have been given to a mute shepherd up in the mountains to be raised to see, what language those babies speak. And of course, this this has been called the forbidden experiment because it's obviously unethical and cruel, right. And nobody has actually, except for these potentially historical monarchs, has actually ever done this experiment. And but that's the kind of experiment a mad scientist would want to do. And so I was trying to think about, well, what would be some proxies for that experiment? And one set of proxies is like you mentioned, is unintentional communities where groups of people have suddenly and unexpectedly been thrown together and obliged to make social order anew. Like shipwrecks, for example, or miners. Like, there was that famous case of those, I think they were the South American miners that were underground for months. They had to live there, or nuclear submarines, or prisons, for example. So there are many kinds of situations in which, or for example, after natural disasters, when people fled Hurricane Katrina or take up residence in refugee camps and they have to sort of remake society, what kind of rules do they put in place and so on? So I review mostly the shipwrecks and some other examples in these unintentional communities. Now, of course, that's not a perfect experiment because these are adults. They'd already been encultured. Right. We can't be certain, etc. But, it's something. Then I look at intentional communities, and intentional communities are deliberate efforts humans have been making. It turns out for thousands of years. We have records going back to Roman times where people have said, the world is screwed up. Let's go and try again. Let's set up a commune and try to live life differently. And almost always those efforts fail. And people wind up replicating the society from which they came. So you have kibbutzes, for example. For example, a classic feature of these intentional communities is to implement communal child rearing, because all of these communities immediately realize that the gendering of childcare, many of them want women to be equal participants in the society and think that they're unfairly burdened by childcare, or they want the children not to have loyalty to their parents because they want a kind of communal sensibility where we all belong to this group and the family unit. They want to break down the family unit. So many communes have over the years attempted to have communal child rearing, and it's never worked. Within a generation or two, it is abandoned. And so on. So those are intentional communities where people are trying to do that. And I look at those. And then last, I look at, and here I rely on a lot of experiments we've been doing in my laboratory. I look at artificial communities. And first off, there are, all these online societies, whether it's The Sims or World, what is it, World of Warcraft? I forgot what it's called, or Second Life or eLife. I mean, there are many.
It's also a Fortnite or Minecraft. Are these also considered as well? I
didn't look at those, but there are many.
Same idea.
Yeah, same idea. Many examples of this. And the question is, well, in those worlds where we're released from our corporeal bodies, and in principle we could make up any rules we wanted for social interaction, how do people interact? And then finally, in this category, I've done a lot of experiments. We've written some software in my laboratory called Breadboard. And you can see a little video about that if you go to breadboard.yale.edu. And this software allows us to create temporary artificial societies of real people. And something like 30,000 or more people now have come through our lab in the last 10 years online. And we have dropped them into these little 20-minute, 30-minute, 60-minute environments where they interact with other real people. And we, in this kind of godlike way, experiment with what kind of social order do we want, and then try other ideas to see if it affects what happens. Anyway, so we have unintentional, intentional, and artificial societies. And across all of this literature and all of these studies, I am persuaded that there's only one realistic way to be social, and that it follows these elements of the social suite that I discussed. So that's the point of those chapters.
Yeah, the thing that comes out in all of them of some sort is this proclivity or propensity for some type of cooperation. Now, that's not to say that all these groups are cooperative, right? But that there is some way of saying, hey, if we do things together, we can, it's kind of like the superordinate goals, right? We have this problem. We need to get, we have some issue we have to resolve. If we band together, we can maybe, achieve the goal. That there's some sense of altruism, right? Well, if, just 3 of us are succeeding and we're not kind of taking care of others, and well, that's not going to be very helpful if we're trying to get off an island or if we're trying to survive or whatever. Is those things in all 3 of those categories, unintentional, intentional, and even in the artificial place, what is the role, I guess, out of the social suite that you would, or the emphasis you would put on how we cooperate or how we have some sense of altruism? Is that, ask a different way, is that a type of just a thing within human nature? Now, it's not exclusive to human nature. I mean, you can see this in other species, but is there something about what it means to be human that says, how do I cooperate just as a social animal, or don't, but that's a yes, unifying piece there?
Yes. I mean, we cannot escape our cooperative impulses. Now, there are some people who are raised in such a brutal fashion who are not cooperative.
Yeah.
My analogy there would be if I I could stunt your body by starving you as a child, and you would grow up to be short or to be more likely to have diabetes, be something wrong with your pancreas because you were starved as a child. But that deficient body imposed on you because of an awful environment no more illustrates the proper normal functioning of a body than a deficient society illustrates the proper normal functioning of a society. So there are ways in which you can raise people or constrain societies such that they veer off from this natural course. You can get societies that are riven with warfare. Maybe, for example, because the environment is very deficient. There's no resources in the environment. So people are falling on each other to kill each other to fight over some scraps. But that is not the normal trajectory, is my argument. Just like a stunted body is not the normal trajectory. First point. Second point, our natural tendency, I would argue, is in fact to be cooperative and altruistic and, to manifest these desirable qualities. Most of us, most of the time. But another thing that's very important to say is that just because we have these so-called good qualities, not so-called, I am calling them good, and they are good, just because we have these good qualities of cooperation and friendship and love and so on, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be put to good ends. So the Nazis were very cooperative with each other. They're quite friendly with each other, right? But they worked together to kill someone else, okay? So it's important not to conflate these qualities, or like, a gun, you can think of a gun as this miraculous machine. It can be put to good use, to hunt food that you eat and survive, or to murder people. Right. So, it's important not to conflate or misunderstand what I'm saying. So I am saying that we have this extraordinary and admirable and good ability to cooperate with each other, that we cannot escape it, that it is one of the things that equips us for social life, but it can also be used for evil purposes.
Yeah, it reminds me of somebody I've had on the podcast, and I'm friendly with. We're friends, and she's absolutely wonderful. Is the work by Nicola Rehani, and she's a researcher out in the United Kingdom, and she wrote the book The Social Instinct. I don't know if you've read it or you're familiar with her work, but she does a lot of work and research on cooperate. I mean, the book's about cooperation, and she has a biology background, and she looks at it in how does cooperation work throughout the animal kingdom and in various species. So she looks at fish and ants and I think primates, and she looks at different animals to say, look, there's lessons to be learned about cooperation from other species, and then here's how we do it that's also similar, but then also how it's different in some ways. But also part of her work is on punishment, right? And so back half of her book, and I talked about it with her when she was on here, and is just that, is, look, people talk about cooperation as this good thing, which is what it is in one sense, but there are many perverse and negative qualities of cooperation, such as you just mentioned. People can cooperate together to really do serious harm to somebody else, right? So there's this kind of and I don't know if that's entirely a human thing.
Like to burn witches at the stake.
Right. And we have our own 21st century version of that nowadays. But we have this idea of cooperation as this kind of good thing. But there are negative aspects of cooperation, and that's the threat of punishment is a very serious kind of thing. And so, how do we, I didn't know if you were familiar with her work, but how do we understand some of those ways in which, something that can be so good or so, powerfully motivating can also be used for more nefarious intentions? Is that just a bug in the system, or how do we understand this throughout time?
Well, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are two parts to your question. One has to do with punishment, and one, the misapplication of cooperative impulses. I don't think there's any easy way to correct the latter, in the sense that that's sort of the downside of cooperation in a way. It's the same thing like teaching. Teaching is a wonderful thing, to teach someone else something. But, you could teach someone to make a bomb, for example. So, right. You have to be careful in how we're talking about these things. On the punishment question, there's been quite a lot of terrific research, mostly by others. I haven't done much work on punishment. I've done a little on the importance of punishment for the emergence of cooperation. In other words, sustaining cooperation is extremely difficult. So, for example, the classic example of this is in something called there are these economic games that are simple distillations of the cooperative dilemma. For example, like the prisoner's dilemma is a classic example, or the tragedy of the commons is another classic example. But an even simpler version is this idea that I'm given $10. And I'm supposed to divide it, and between you and me. And I offer you some fraction of the money, and then you get to decide whether we both keep our share. It's called the ultimatum game. So the question is, well, how much do I offer? And I should offer, in principle, the most limited amount that you would be willing to accept. Now, according to strict economic theory, you should even be willing to accept a penny. So if I'm given $10 and I offer you a penny, you should say, yes, a penny for you is better than nothing. So you'll keep the penny and I'll keep $9.99.
But that's not fair. That's not fair.
Exactly. Anyone listening to this immediately knows that's not what happens. If I offer you a penny or even $1, you might say, screw you, Christakis. Neither of us can keep our money. The question is, well, what's the amount that I should offer? And in an American society, the typical offer, this has been studied in detail. I don't remember the precise amount, but it's close to half the money. There are a few societies in the world where people offer somewhat more than half. So I give you like $6 out of the $10. And many societies, they wind up, I don't know, between a third and a half is the typical offer in the ultimatum game. We willingly part with this money. It's a kind of a measure of our intrinsic altruism in a way, and of yours, by the way. Then we can look at what the typical offer is, and then we can look at, well, how low does it have to be before you reject it, for instance? So this type of very simple game is a way of measuring cooperation. And but what's interesting is that often cooperation breaks down and people don't cooperate. And the question is, well, how can we get them to cooperate? And one way is to make the interaction repeated. Like tit for tat, for example. So if I cooperate this round and you cooperate, and then the next round it's your turn to divide up the pot, and we take turns cooperating repeatedly across time, we learn to be nice to each other for fear that the other person might, ruin the game and defect.
Mm-hmm.
And so repeated interactions are a way to sustain cooperation.
Mm.
Another way to sustain cooperation, however, is to add the possibility of punishment. I could punish you for not cooperating, or even better, a third party could punish you for not cooperating.
Mm.
And this is another way that cooperation can emerge and be sustained in animal groups. And we see the emergence of punishment, very widely.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a deep, unfortunately, punishment is part of the picture
Mm-hmm.
For cooperation.
Yeah.
Incidentally, in-group bias also is probably related to cooperation. And this is some work by Sergei Gavrilets and many others have done this kind of work. I'm blocking some of their names right now. But so the idea is, and we see this actually as a problem in our society right now, because the predilection we have to favor members of our own group, however defined, that predilection probably emerged in evolutionary time as a solution to the problem of non-cooperation. How do we get groups to cooperate? Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
Imagine you had 1,000 people in a population, and you kind of spoke to them in a megaphone, and you said, okay, everyone, be nice to your neighbors. Anytime you encounter someone, willingly give of your own resources to this other person, and everyone's supposed to act in the same way, to share resources and be nice to their neighbors. Well, the problem is that if you were in that population, you don't know these other people,
Mm-hmm.
these other 999 people. You might give someone resources, but you might never see them again.
Right.
They might disappear, or you might not recognize them. There's so many of them. How could you keep track of who you gave stuff to you and who you gave stuff to and so on?
Mm-hmm.
So as a result, in that type of situation, you find that pretty much nobody will cooperate. It doesn't make sense to give of your resources to others in that population, in that so-called unstructured population, where you're just a mass of 1,000 people. And you're bumping into each other and you're supposed to be nice to each other. It doesn't work. So evolution, and you find that among the 1,000, you get, let's say, zero cooperation. I'm simplifying and extremifying the example, but let's say it's like that. You get zero cooperation. Well, now let's say I tell everybody, okay, everyone, we're going to divide you into 10 groups of 100, and you're going to wear different colored t-shirts, a purple shirt and a green shirt and a blue shirt. And now just be nice to people with your own shirt color. So now you're moving through the population, and now the problem you already, as soon as I've even described it this way, you probably said, well, that's much easier.
Mm-hmm.
There are only 100 of us with my shirt color. I'm more likely to bump into them. I can use this as a heuristic of who I should be nice to. They're more likely to be nice to me, and so on. And then you ignore and are not nice to all the others, okay? Mm-hmm. So this is in-group bias. And the emergence of in-group bias adds some structure to the population. And it turns out in a population like that, you get higher levels of cooperation. And so it's likely that this depressing feature of our humanity, this fact that we prefer our own group, however defined, to other groups, probably is part and parcel of our capacity for altruism. But evolution has also given us other solutions to add structure. And one of them is to take this amorphous mass of 1,000 people and make it into a network, so that everyone is not connected to everyone else, but everyone is just connected to a few other people. And now you add network structure. And now I tell you, you know what? Just be nice to your friends. Everyone is nice to their friends. Everyone has different friends. You've added network structure to the population. And that means there's a deep connection between social networks and cooperation. And there is. All these elements of the social suite. So personal identity, friendship, love, social networks, in-group bias, mild hierarchy, teaching, and I forgot the eighth one right now, cooperation, are all interrelated. So friendship emerged. One of the ideas about why we evolved to have friends is that it helps us solve the problem of working together. I'll say one other thing about this, which is that we are very unusual as a species in that we have friends. Probably every listener is taking it for granted that they have friends, and most people have friends, and you feel good when you're with your friends. That feeling that you get when you're with your friends is a wonderful feeling. Very natural. We all think, well, it is natural, actually, that we evolved to have that feeling, and we evolved to have friendships. And but it's very rare in the animal kingdom. So friendships are long-term, non-reproductive unions with unrelated conspecifics. We do it. Certain other primates do it. Elephants do it, both African and Asian elephants, the two extant species, and certain cetacean species do it. It's really rare in the animal kingdom. Friendship is rare. But elephants evolved the capacity for friendship independent of us. So both of these very different animals evolved to live socially in this way. Elephants have friends. Dolphins have friends. They also evolved independently of us to do this thing, which is amazing. And they did it because it helped solve a problem of cooperation in part.
Is that a feature of convergent evolution where, it's kind of like with flying and things like that?
Yeah. Just like other physical traits of animals or plants could evolve independently to solve challenges imposed by the environments. My argument in the book is that friendship evolved independently to solve challenges in the environment. So an animal species that could evolve the capacity for friendship will outperform otherwise identical species that did not evolve the capacity for friendship. So it's favored by evolution. The ability to have friends would be favored in certain circumstances where it's beneficial to live socially.
Yeah,
but we don't live like zebras or crocodiles or hippopotami, in some kind of massive agglomeration of animals. We live in networks. We don't just all a jumble. We're not just. We have specific friends.
I want to go back to the in-group thing real quick, and I'm gonna merge two things here, two interest things for you. So I'll try to keep us on track because I'm sure we can very easily dovetail off of this.
I'm being long-winded, I'm being.
No. You're great. I'm setting it up because I know it's a huge topic. So okay, in terms of the in-group, I'm really curious about this, right? So I think this will kind of this will be a nice example for what you're describing. I'm curious for your thoughts on this because it's a very kind of in the moment thing. Oh my goodness. So over the past 2.5 years, it's been an absolute mind fuck.
That's a technical term.
That's my technical term of how people have coalesced and splintered based on ideas of various aspects of the pandemic. And of COVID and of vaccines and of masks and lockdowns and all of these things. And I mean, I know you have just as much as I have, both in the workplace, in my personal life with friends, but certainly in the digital space of social networks. And there has been this not only an in-group kind of thing based on whichever particular thing somebody is signaling. I wear a mask that says, virtue on it when I'm in the car by myself, or I don't wear a mask right in front of the sign that says I have to, or whatever. And people will have these ways in which they will align themselves. And this goes all the way up for vaccines, the whole thing. What's happening? What is going on with us as humans, where there's obviously something that has happened, has occurred globally. We don't want to die. We don't want to get sick. We don't want to have problems. And there's different ways of doing that. And that's not to say that there haven't been missteps by, CDC and all the rest, but, the way in which we cooperate and the ways in which we don't, in which we have made certain things an in-group thing and certain things an out-group. And further, it's not only, well, this is part of my group, but part of what I've seen is that the identity of that in-group is to be the anti of another group of sorts. And it's a very it seems like it's a evolving, morphing thing. So just maybe use that as an example of the things we've been discussing.
Yes. No, I mean, we are in a moment in North America and actually worldwide where we have ascendant tribalism, which is manifesting itself in nationalism too in many countries, and manifesting itself in racism and all kinds of awful ways. We have a kind of ascendant tribalism right now, which is causing us a lot of problems.
Yeah.
And there are a couple of things I could say about that. The first thing I could say is that, and this is an old topic in the social sciences, which is the question of why we have to hate the other group, why we can't just love our own group.
Right.
In other words, if you love your own group but are indifferent, let's say, to another group, there's a world of difference between that. You say, I think our group is special and we don't care about other groups.
Mm-hmm.
There's a world of difference between that and saying, oh, those other groups need to be put into ovens,
mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Why we can't at least just be indifferent to other groups? And as you were just saying, why, and to what extent does the ability to define our own group require us or abet our desire to demonize the other group? In other words, it's precisely by demonizing the other group that we feel good about ourselves,
right?
Which is awful
mm-hmm.
and needless, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And I discuss in the book a lot of this. As you know, there are all these famous experiments, the so-called minimal group paradigm, where, for example, you can take toddlers and randomly assign them to get T-shirts. And you can test that they understand that it's random, like that the toddlers have some sense of chance,
mm-hmm.
that it's not that they were given a yellow T-shirt or a purple T-shirt because they were good and the other guy was bad. They know it's chance. They just got a different color T-shirt. And you randomly assign them these T-shirts. And just by giving them different T-shirt colors, they come to hate the other group. They're like, oh, those children with the purple shirts, they're bad children. They should not be given any toys. Actually, they should be punished. Is what did happen. It's awful. I mean, it's so depressing. And my colleague Paul Bloom has done. I don't know if you've had him on the show.
I've talked to him.
Yeah, he's phenomenal.
Yeah,
anyway,
he's great.
Former colleague. He's now left Yale. But anyway, Paul
mm-hmm.
has done a tremendous work on this
mm-hmm.
and done experiments. And many scientists have studied this topic. But anyway, it's the so-called minimal group paradigm. You just scratch the surface of human beings and you can elicit this. Or you take grown men and you put them in different uniforms and say, kill the people
mm-hmm.
with the other uniform,
mm-hmm.
and they'll willingly go out and kill these people with the other uniform.
Mm-hmm.
So, by the way, even that in the military conflict, if you interview soldiers why they're risking their lives, the reason they give is not often ideological. They're risking their lives for their friends.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so the Army has cultivated these deep friendships, this sort
mm-hmm.
of band of brothers idea.
Yeah.
They take great personal risks for their friends.
Mm-hmm.
So again, friendship is rearing its head in all of these qualities. But what I'd like to do is go on a brief tangent and come back and more forcefully answer your question on ascendant tribalism.
Sure.
The tangent I want to go in on is one of these other elements of the social suite that I briefly mentioned earlier, but I didn't describe, which is this notion of identity. Mm. It's one of the deep ironies of social life that in order to live socially, we must first be individuals. Mm. And in our species, we communicate this with our faces. Think about, why do all of us have different faces? Mm. It's actually an evolutionary luxury to all have different faces. Mm. For your kidneys to do their job, they have to function like every other person's kidney. Mm. But for your face to do its job, it has to look different than every other person's face. Mm-hmm. So and not only that, but other people have to recognize it. So we have this very expensive, evolutionarily speaking, apparatus of signaling our uniqueness by each of us having a different face, instead of all having the same kind of face, like we all have, let's say, the same kind of kidney, mm-hmm. and to be able to recognize. We devote, 10 or 20% of our brain or some large fraction of our brain to detecting the difference. You can look at a sea of faces and you can immediately recognize who you know and you don't know. You can also make inferences about who's whose sibling, mm-hmm. who's whose child, just by the similarity of their faces. Mm-hmm. It's a very powerful tool that we have. So this capacity to signal our uniqueness, which, by the way, is very valuable. Like, if you don't want other people to forget that they've been kind to you, mm-hmm. or that they've had sex with you, or that they've been violent to you, or you want to say, look, it's me, your child, feed me, not someone else.
Right.
You need a way to signal your uniqueness and your identity that's recognized by someone else. So we've evolved. Part of the social suite is, ironically, the capacity to be individuals and to recognize our individuality. Okay.
And that there's some phenotypic aspect to that as well.
Yes.
Yeah, that's in concert with the environment and our social kinds of dynamics.
Yes,
yeah,
that's right. So, okay, that was my tangent. Let me come back to tribalism. So the question is, right now we have ascendant tribalism in the United States along every line you can imagine: race, religion, socioeconomic status, immigrant status, sexual behavior, sexual identity, and so on. And it's very depressing to me. Partly because of my liberal political commitments. You know, I'm an old school liberal, and partly because of my philosophical commitments. I believe in our common humanity. I mean, that's what the book is about. It's about that there's more that unites us than divides us.
Right.
And it's very depressing for me to see all this tribalism, like it's depressing for many people. But what's interesting is our evolution has endowed us with the ability to escape it in two ways. So one way is to go up a level. So let's say we have 1,000 people in the population. We have 10 groups of 100 that are being very tribal. One solution is to go up a level to the population level and say, no, you know, we're all Americans. And this is the de Tocqueville analysis of American society. Like, it doesn't really matter that, you know, you're white or black or urban or rural or rich or poor or any other division. That's not what matters. We're all Americans, and we have as Americans certain fundamental commitments to civil liberties, to constitutional liberties, to the whole notion that anyone can be an American, by the way, which is historically very special, right? Send me your unwashed and your poor, send me your immigrants. We're a nation of immigrants. Anyone can be an American. You just come to our society, you sign up to the Bill of Rights, and bang, you know, you're an American.
It's speaking to almost like this healthy notion or idea of nationalism, not the perverse version, but like this healthy sense of it.
Yes, although I'm not arguing for nationalism there. I'm illustrating a solution to tribalism, which is to go up a level. Actually, the level I would love for us to go up to is all the way up to we're all human beings.
We're all human beings, right.
But at a minimum, you can go up to the population-wide level. So that's a kind of de Tocqueville analysis. But you can also do something else to eliminate tribalism, and that's to go down a level. And this is the Martin Luther King solution. What Martin Luther King famously says is he looks forward to a time when his children will be judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. What he's saying is each person should be seen as an individual, not as a mere member of some amorphous group. And that's also true, right? Like what we really, you know, we should not think like all gay people think alike, or all white people think alike, or all, rural people think alike, or that's just not true, right? That is just absolutely not true. And it effaces the individual, and it leads to and supports this kind of tribalism, which I think is ultimately inimical to a civilized society, certainly to a liberal society. To have this much tribalism. And so I think, like you, I am very concerned about where we are as a society right now. And I think in some ways we are playing to the worst or bad aspects of human nature. But thankfully, because I'm an optimist, there are good qualities that we are capable of. One other detail, and then I'll shut up, is we have in our brains the ability to make distinctions, right? In a moment ago, I said, imagine the kids. It's not just that they can see the color yellow and the color purple, that they have optical systems and color vision. It's that they can cognitively draw a distinction, a boundary between yellow and purple T-shirts. And think, this is in one group, this is in another group, and they need to be treated differently. And that ability to draw distinctions, which is crucial to in-group bias, to draw a boundary and say, okay, this is us and that's them. A feature of that, which often goes unmentioned, is that ability is ours, and the boundary is arbitrary. So another potential solution is to is to exploit this feature and say, look, these are arbitrary boundaries that you are drawing. They're just arbitrary. You needn't draw them, in fact. So anyway.
Yeah, I think it's hard sometimes where people kind of get stuck and they don't see how arbitrary it is, and they become kind of encapsulated in this ownership of it. You touched on many things. We talked about identity and friendship and cooperation. I want to ask about culture. We didn't really touch on pair bonding too much, a little bit, but I want to touch on culture though, because I know this is relevant to your work as well. Obviously there's much work that's been done on this, work you've done, and obviously work that Joe Henrich's done, and et cetera. How do we understand cultural evolution, and how do we understand what is the impact of culture for other types of animals, but then for us as humans in terms of status and prestige and some of the genetic components of it, and why culture and what that is and how we define it so kind of the tracks on how we run as humans now. What is the kind of essential feature of culture for us specifically as humans, and then kind of generally for other species?
Yeah, well, I think I'd like to try to address that vast topic. And Joe Henrich, of course, is also, I don't know if you've had him on the show.
Yeah. We talked.
Another terrific scientist.
Yeah, he's great.
I'd like to step back and just and talk about the following. I'd like to talk about learning first. So many animals, most animals, probably all animals, can learn through contact with their environment. So a little fish swimming in the sea can learn that if it swims up to the light, it'll find food there. And that's called independent learning, where an animal on its own, through contact with the environment, learns something, internalizes something about the environment, encodes some information. But some animals can learn socially. For example, you put your hand in the fire and you learn that you burn your hand. And so you learn that fire burns. You've now learned something by independent learning. But I could watch you put your hand in the fire, and I gain almost as much knowledge, fire burns, but I pay none of the price. Right. My hand is unburnt. So that's very efficient social learning, right? Or for example, you and I go into the forest, and you eat red berries and die. And I watch you eat the red berries and die, and I'm like, wow, I better not eat red berries. Right. So that's like a really powerful way of learning something, where I can learn valuable things about the environment without having to run any risk, okay? That's social learning. But we do something that's, and quite a few animals do social learning by mimicry and other processes. Many fewer than do independent learning. But we do something even more than social learning, which is exceedingly rare in the animal kingdom, which is that we teach each other things. I teach you to build a fire. And this is extremely rare in the animal kingdom. Very few species do this. And it lies at the root of our capacity for culture. So we can accumulate knowledge and transmit it across distance and time. So we spread information. I teach you something, and then you teach someone else something, and information spreads. This is what makes it possible for us to have culture and to accumulate knowledge and to bequeath it to our descendants. Every human being that's alive today, you and I, when we were born, we were given this vast gift of knowledge that had been developed by our ancestors. All animals and plants had already been domesticated thousands of years ago. People figured that out. So when you and I were born, chickens and cows and camels and goats and all those animals had been domesticated. Calculus had been invented. We were taught calculus in high school. If you took me back 500 years, I'd be the smartest mathematician on the planet because of what I learned in high school. Newton's gift to us, and so on. And on and on. Metallurgy, all the how to fabricate metals, rope technology. I mean, just all of this stuff that was knowledge that was acquired by human beings was bequeathed to us and was our patrimony and made us more able to live better lives. So we have this capacity for cumulative culture, and that's almost unheard of in the animal kingdom. There are some examples in primates of the transmission across generations of innovations. For example, I think there's one famous example of how primates learned to crack nuts, where they were cracking them for a very long time, and then they basically learned to build a stone anvil, and thereafter cracked it with an anvil, and then they taught it to subsequent generations. So this group of primates was using a different technology than they used to use. Kept perfecting the technology across time and transmitting it to subsequent generations. So this capacity we have for teaching lies at the root of our ability to culture, and ultimately lies at the root of why we are one of the ascendant species on the planet, because we have this ability. Now, I've gone off on a long tangent. I forgot.
No, that was just that. I was asking about culture, and then the kind of way I wanted to tie it up.
I'm sorry. One other detail was because of our ability to teach, we have, and I'm sure Joe talked about this on the show, we have in our species two different ways of having status and hierarchy. So we have the ability, like most species, to have a kind of physical, despotic hierarchy where my status depends on my ability to threaten my subordinates, to physically harm my subordinates. So many, like elephant seals and deer that fight with big antlers, and despotic primates, like the top dog is like biting and beating, the gorilla that is the biggest gorilla can, have the most power and status in gorilla society because he can impose, he can threaten his subordinates and they back off and stay away from him. So that's one kind of status that many animal species have, or hierarchy. But we have another one because of our capacity for culture, which is in parallel to that, which is our ability to confer benefits on others, not just harms, by giving them valuable information. And therefore, we can teach each other things of value. So people can have prestige. You can have prestige in our species by your ability not just to harm others, but to benefit others. And in a prestige hierarchy, in a dominance hierarchy, you avoid your superordinates because they will harm you. But in this type of prestige hierarchy, you approach your superordinates because of the benefit they can confer. And so we have all these examples of famous teachers where their students flock to them and come to learn from them. And they are seen as holy men or wise men or women. They're seen as special people. And of course, all of us, forget just special people, all of us do this in our everyday life. We approach people who know more than we do so we can learn. You see, and this gives us a completely different and parallel track to the kind of dominance hierarchy and helps shape our species. And by the way, you see the same thing in elephants, for example, where elephants that have knowledge about where to find water, or in times of drought and so on, they are revered and are followed in their social groups.
Yeah, I mean, all of these pieces that you've been talking about, I mean, really do kind of give the the basic building blocks of sorts of really what the book is about, which is how to have a good society. When you talk about cooperation, we've talked about friendship, we've talked about different types of relationships, the social suite, and I think all of these things are continuously more relevant. Before I let you go, I do want to ask you kind of a sort of epilogue of sorts. And so last time we talked about some of the stuff with the pandemic. I'm gonna read you something, some of your words. This is from Apollo's Arrows. So this is, I'm sure you've heard this at different points. This is what you said. You said, either way, until 2022, which is where we're at, Americans will live in an acutely changed world. They'll be wearing masks and avoiding crowded places, which is the intermediate pandemic period. And for a few years after, we'll reach either herd immunity or have a widely distributed vaccine. People will still be recovering from the overall clinical, psychological, social, and economic shock of the pandemic, perhaps through 2024, which is the intermediate pandemic period. And then the world, gradually things will return to normal, albeit in a world with some persistent changes. And around 2024, the post-pandemic period will likely begun. That timeline, really stuck out to me when I read it. We're back half of 22, going into 23. How, based on everything that we've known up to this point and variants and how things are going, and I think we have new vaccines coming in a month or so, where are we on the timeline? Do you still hold to that? And how do you see things as it's evolving and changing with the pandemic, and then anything for future pandemics that may arise?
Well, I mean, I wrote that book. I started writing it in March of 2020, and I delivered it to the publisher in July of 2020, and it was published in October of 2020.
So wild.
and I think that forecast has proven exactly correct.
Yes, it's pretty close.
And it's not because I'm some kind of special savant. It's because I went to school. This is what you're taught when you go to public health school, as I did. Mm-hmm. And people have been medical historians and epidemiologists and virologists and all kinds of scientists have been writing about respiratory pandemics actually for 100 years. And over the last 30 or 40 years, we've learned a lot about respiratory pandemics, and they follow a certain pattern, and ours is following, by and large, that pattern. And so the argument in the book, which has held, is that there are three phases to a serious respiratory pandemic. The first phase, the opening act, is when we are feeling the biological and epidemiological impact of the virus as a new pathogen sweeps through the human population, infecting and killing at will. And that phase would persist until such time as we had reached herd immunity, either through vaccination, ideally, or through natural infection, and many people would die. And let's not forget, over 1 million Americans have died. That's a large number of Americans, and we're still losing 500 people a day. Right now in the summer, and it's going to go up this coming winter. We're going to have another third winter wave. Usually these respiratory pandemics, they come every winter for 3 or 4 or 5 years, and typically the waves get smaller in amplitude. The number of deaths with time decreases, but we're still not through with this. And 500 deaths a day, by the way, is an enormous toll of death. I mean, that's like 160,000 people per year. That's like the number 3 or number 4 killer in our society, still is COVID at 500 deaths a day, below cancer and heart disease. Yeah. So this is really bad still. Of course, we've all gotten inured to this now and used to it, which we can talk about. But anyway, the opening act would last, I said, until 2022 approximately, and it's going to be approximately correct. And then it's like a tsunami that's washed ashore. The waters are causing devastation. They're bringing boats inland 3 miles, they're piling up cars, and so on. And but then the water recedes, which is great, but they leave this catastrophic mess, which we need to clean up. And that's the intermediate phase, when we're coping with the social, economic, psychological, and clinical aftershocks of the virus. And we're seeing some of that now, right? We have economic disruptions. Millions of kids have missed school. They need remedial attention. Millions of people are grieving. They've lost loved ones. We've seen the Great Resignation. People are rejiggering. There's always occupational impacts of pandemics going back hundreds of years. And we're seeing some of that. All of this stuff, you see, is we're going to have to work our way through, let alone the biological aftershocks with new variants and some other headaches. And I think that this period of ferment or turmoil is going to last for another couple of years until 2024. And then I think finally we will put the pandemic behind us approximately in 2024 when we enter the post-pandemic period. And I think that's going to be a little bit of a party. I think that's going to be like the roaring 20s of the 21st century, like the roaring 20s of the 20th century. I think people have been cooped up and constrained. I think people are going to sort of, relentlessly seek out social interactions in nightclubs and restaurants and sporting events and political rallies and concerts and so on. I think we might see a kind of loosening of sexual mores. My sister says that I need to always explain that this applies to unmarried members of our society, not to married members. But I think people are going to start spending their money. I think we're going to have an economic boom. So anyway, those are the 3 phases: the immediate, the intermediate, and the post-pandemic phase. Roughly till 2022, 2024 are the roughly. And all of this, by the way, could change. I think it's unlikely, but all bets would be off if new variants emerge, which either fully evade the vaccines, or are much deadlier. And there are coronaviruses which are much deadlier than SARS-CoV-2. And if, heaven forbid, we were to see such a virus, then then I think we would be back at square one with this pandemic, which would be awful.
Two quick questions, just I guess on that is there have been, this is the last time I talked to you, there's Omicron, which was huge, right? I got Omicron. That's when it hit me, even though I had been vaccinated. And then it happened, I think, somewhat earlier in the spring, people were just even more recently, people were getting it, but it was very mild. Are we still going to keep seeing that where we're getting, variants, even if you got 4 shots in you, and even if you've already had it once, we're going to still keep seeing that?
Yes, of course. And this is, and I talk about this in Apollo Zero as well. I talk about how, this virus is going to be with us forever. And there may be some precedent. In 1890, there was something called the Russian flu, which previously was thought to be an influenza virus. But some scientists believe, and I suspect, I'm not certain, there's not enough evidence to know, may actually have been a coronavirus. And that coronavirus may have been something called OC43. And I discuss in Apollo Zero, I talk about this case in the last chapter, I think. And that coronavirus is still with us, but it just causes a common cold.
Yeah.
Just get the sniffles when you get that coronavirus. And I think that's what's going to happen with SARS-CoV-2. Going to circulate and circulate. People will be exposed to it when they're children, one or another variant. Children thankfully have mild infections in response to coronavirus, but they acquire some immunity. And then if you're re-exposed in adulthood, you'll not be seriously affected. Plus, we have vaccination. It's a little bit like chickenpox. Yeah. Like you probably may remember that if you have chickenpox as a kid, you get lifelong immunity. Yeah. Chickenpox sucks as a kid, but it doesn't kill you.
Yeah. That week or whatever is not fun, but
yeah. But if you've never had chickenpox and you get it for the first time as an adult, it can kill you.
Oh, yeah. It's dangerous. Yeah.
So there are a bunch of viruses that do that, by the way. So I think SARS-CoV-2 is going to be like that.
And then I guess just about all of the, I'm not going to name names, but there's been plenty of people that have been incentivized and have made so much money on just talking a lot of bullshit about, a lot of the serious misinformation, disinformation, or just asking questions, or whatever the whole thing is. There's a lot of people that have done that. And I think a lot of bad faith actors, maybe some okay faith, good faith actors, maybe. But, it just, I don't really have a liking to some of that. I mean, is again kind of tying with the social networks and in-group bias and all that stuff. I mean, are we going to keep seeing this, or are people going to finally let it go and be like, okay, I mean,
I think, look, anytime there's a serious threat or disruption to our way of life, and resources need to be allocated or reallocated, it's a political problem, right? Like if you're from the moment you're saying, look, we have epidemiological reasons we want to close the schools, even if those reasons are sound, it becomes a political topic because people have different ideas about whether schools should be closed because it imposes consequences to different subgroups of the population who are inconvenienced in different ways or harmed or benefited in different ways. And that's always a topic of politics. So the fact that it's been political hasn't surprised me too much. But I have been saddened at the politicization of the factual basis of the pandemic.
Yeah.
In other words, it's one thing for us to say, yes, school closure, we estimate based on best available data would result in this reduction in death because of reduction in transmission in the virus. And we all agree to that. But we disagree about whether to close the schools nevertheless. Right. Because some people think, well, the harm to children is too much. For example, my brother, who's one of the nation's leading pediatricians, he was really back in March of 2020, we didn't really know all the details. It made sense to close the schools. But very quickly, we discovered more about the virus and how it affected kids and how it spread. And my brother was in one of those people who thought, well, we should reopen the schools. That how can we have a his name is Dimitri Christakis, a very Greek name, of course. How can we have cities in which the bars are open but the schools are closed? That means completely nonsensical. It's imposing risks on children and burdens on children, and we're not imposing them on adults. But other people didn't think that. For example, I was a little bit more cautious about reopening the schools. But that's a debate about costs and benefits and how to assign them. It's not a debate about the fundamental facts.
Right.
The same thing goes, by the way, with vaccination. All these stupid debates about how harmful the vaccines are, how beneficial they are. I mean, these numbers are known, right? You can, and as time, and it's a moving target. Okay. 2 years ago, we didn't know so much, a year ago, but we know more and more as time goes by. And so we can start with that basis. And then, for example, we can agree on how beneficial vaccines are, but disagree about whether they should be mandated or not. Right? But if you're against mandated vaccination, it's not rational for you to say, well, they don't work. I mean, that's false. I mean, that's just false. So anyway, so that part has distressed me. And I think that's not a healthy society in which, I think in a healthy society, we need to tolerate our political disagreements, recognize that people won't see the world the same way we do, and that, we have to have some kind of process whereby we resolve our differences. But I don't think, ideally, we should resolve our differences by misrepresenting the facts. Yeah. And that's that latter part that I think has been harmful to us.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Well, Nicholas, it's been fabulous. I appreciate you for your time and all of your wisdom. The book is Blueprints, The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society, and also Apollo's Arrow, Profound and Enduring Impact of Coronavirus on the Way We Live. Any books in the works, and where can people find you?
You can find out more about our research in my lab at humannaturelab.net. And I have another book which I'm working on, which is probably going to take me 5 or 10 years. So it's far too early to talk about. But thank you, Xavier. Thank you so much for having me back on the show.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure.